Merk, President and Chief Investment Officer of Merk Investments, with my morning update here during these tumultuous times. Trying to give you a little bit of in between the line readings of what's happening. Incidentally, we published our business chart book, business cycle chart book report this morning. We publish a consistent set of charts, and of course, when you look at charts, they, for the most part anyway, cannot possibly reflect the very short-term things that have been happening. And so we try to do our best to do our in-between the line readings and so forth. You can get them from our website at merkinvestments.com/research. But on a similar note, when corporations give you an update, and we heard this morning from one of the nation's largest fast food chains, their same-store sales were down 20% last month. That cannot possibly be the worst of it yet, both because many of the restrictions were phased in during the month. And then also, if you just think about your own behavior, at least when I reflect on my behavior, beginning of month, even as I consider myself somebody who has been very careful, but still, I increased my caution, so to speak, by right now, for example, even though fast food places are allowed to be going open for takeout, I haven't gone out to have lunch in several weeks. So eating at home, and I'm pretty sure those numbers will get worse. And I mentioned that in part because in the early 90s, I lived in the UK, and at the time there was an economic downturn, and there were layoffs announced in the tens of thousands. This was the 94, I believe it was, or so. Actually, it was 93. In today's environment, it may well be that some of the worst news may happen when markets will have bottomed and will be at the other side of things. The big question, of course, is whether we have seen the lows. We saw yesterday in the market coming down that markets still tend to be very fickle, right? The glass is very easily half full, and when you have a day that's good. As a reminder, when the media covers what's happening in the markets, they need to relate to what's happening in the markets to the day's events. And so you read stories like the market went up because, and then put in the favorite thing that was in the headline. And so when Boris Johnson went to the hospital, people said, well, it's really the second in command, like the healthcare system takes care of it, nobody cares about it. Today, there's news that he hasn't deteriorated, and the sterling is today the best performing G10 currency. So guess what? There are stories out there that because Johnson is doing better, the sterling is doing well. Well, you interpret yourself what that means. Now, obviously, we're human beings. We like to put a storyline behind things. The one thing to keep in mind is that markets are moving for many, many reasons, and a lot of it is, especially in what we saw a few weeks ago, it was forced liquidations, margin calls, and so those sort of ripple effects can do a lot of things. Institutional rebalancing can do a lot of things. And of course, in the background, you have these policy changes, rule changes, and one of the things to remember from the financial crisis is that the rules were changed, sometimes retroactively. So it was very, very difficult to make up your mind. Now, rules are being changed right now as well as we speak. One can relate to them a little bit more, I think, than the ones one could relate to the financial crisis. So as an example, Germany is considering a change in law where if you are if you were hosting or had a ticket for an event, be it a sporting event, a cultural event, I don't know whether conference and things like that are included, but then the proposed law, and I presume it's going to get passed, is that you do not have to give a refund until the end of 2021, and you don't have to give a refund if you are going to hold that event later or a similar event. The point of that, of course, being to preserve the cash flow of these businesses that are very much hit. And so a lot of these things, we see them in the US, we see them in other countries, are about trying to preserve the cash flow. Now, in the meantime, consumers are trying to preserve the cash flow. I heard on Bloomberg Radio today that about a third of renters in New York City, if I heard it correctly, didn't pay their rent this month. And I haven't seen that verified, but that kind of that order of magnitude makes a great deal of sense. Now, that may preserve the the cash or the lack of cash, I suppose, of those consumers. The question is what's going to happen, right? Do they have to pay that later? There are moratoriums in various places that you cannot kick out somebody who doesn't pay. But of course, at the other end of the spectrum, there's of course the landlords, and nobody's going to have pity with the landlord, except in various instances, they are probably highly levered as well. And so if then they go bust, then you do have that ripple effect. And it's those sort of ripple effects that I think we still don't know much about. We don't know yet about the fallout of what's going to happen. I mentioned in prior conversations like these that um, presumably about half the people will get their job back when the economy opens up again, and the rest will take considerably longer. Well, those are all consumers who are not going to spend for an extended period. And so in the meantime, the markets are hunky-dory and going up. And that's all great, and maybe it's all warranted with the dramatic amount of stimulus that we see. Japan is proposing a 1 trillion stimulus now as well. Um, and so those are big numbers. Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter and Stripe, and no investment recommendation here. And while I do that, I give you some other disclosure here to get that out of the way. He will he dedicates $1 billion of his personal fortune to helping, and and this is just an example where there's a lot of there is a quote unquote stimulus coming in from different corners, and so the how this will play out and how will this play out in the markets, I think is very, very difficult um, to say at this stage. Then one other comment I like to make is we've been spending a lot of time last couple of weeks on how do you manage risk in a black swan event. And obviously you should do that ahead of the black swan. I might publish a little note on that in the next week or so if I get to putting these thoughts on paper. But we've looked at, and one of the challenges with these things is you don't have many black swans. By definition, they're almost impossible to predict. You just know that something may well happen. And so the question is, what sort of warning signs can you do? And can you have? And then ultimately, of course, this matters more for anybody who uses leverage. If you don't use leverage, then you may be okay. Now, one of the things I have said and firmly believe in that the one investment that and as you are well aware, I cannot give specific investment advice here, but the one investment recommendation I usually give is you can invest in yourself. Um, if you consider yourself an investment, you obviously generate a lot of income. And so staying healthy, getting educated, and all that what comes with it. Now, the problem with that is that that best investment of all, yourself, has been taken out of commission. And so if you don't have a job right now, that income stream is gone. The good news is that similar to equities, you are a long duration asset, at least in a society as a whole, if one doesn't get sick here. And so that income stream will recover. And so similarly, the sort of business and individuals that are in financial stress, odds are they can renegotiate what their obligations as needed. Whereas those who have been on the brink financially to begin with probably have to declare bankruptcy or have to go through some other sort of restructuring. And there are already headlines out that the big department stores of yesteryear that kind of had been on life support forever, many now believe, and I would agree with that they're just not going to make it. And that's as painful as it is for those affected, that of course frees up new capital to be invested in you. And there were stories out today that in the fracking industry, for example, there will be consolidation. That's a nice way of saying that the stronger folks will gobble up the weaker ones. And of course, the system as a whole might get stronger as a result of that. Now, all that said, the US in particular lives and thrives on small business. So we must ensure that small business will be around. Small business has a much, much tougher time to get out of this. And when we look at financial markets, it's usually big business, right? The S&P 500 is big business, although somebody have pointed out that when this is all said and done, the S&P 500 may look very different. There's a lot of companies might well drop out of the S&P 500. Unlike the Dow, the S&P 500 is far more driven by the market cap, and so there may well be substantial changes. The reason I always look up the camera is because when I kind of moved to my home office here, I didn't take my office camera with me. And so this is a notebook camera, and I have my Bloomberg screen above the notebook. And I'm trying to see whether there's any other item I'd like to mention to you. Just as a reminder, even as the markets have been going up, the VIX index, as I speak, is still at 45. I've been giving you some numbers here on the rates, and there's really no change here. And in some ways, that's news as well. The Fed funds rate being at 5 basis points, and the 3-month LIBOR at 135. So that 3-month LIBOR rate is not coming down. Yesterday, by the way, when we had this rally, the financials were doing very well, and so the banks that had been hit very hard recovered first in Europe and so forth, and then in the US as well. We will get bank earnings pretty soon here, and we'll see how things are progressing here. Obviously, all the big bazookas are aimed at keeping the banking system afloat, and with that, keeping big business afloat. And this may well lead to some backlash down the road. The reason it's done, of course, is because if the big banks were to go belly up, we kind of need them for everything and everybody. We love to blame them, but without them, you cannot have a credit-driven society. And so that's why there's so much support given to it. The one thing, though, I would mention in addition here is that there's a lot of talk about additional stimulus, infrastructure spending, and this and that. I wouldn't be surprised if there are setbacks. I have no doubt there will be additional stimulus, but I don't think it's going to be as smooth a road, so to speak, as this initial $2 trillion package. There will be voices saying, hey, why did these businesses get money and these didn't? More strings will be attached, more red tape will be attached. And so any additional money, I'd be surprised if it A, goes through Congress as quickly, and B, if indeed it is necessarily the most effective way of at some point providing the money to the right places. And so in that context as well, I wouldn't be surprised if the financial markets will have some hiccups along the way that currently rose a very, very good picture, shallow kind of downturn in many ways. So we'll see. We'll see. I mean, historically, money printing raises stock prices, and we're printing a great deal of money. It ultimately comes up to everybody's own risk assessment and process how they follow these things. But that's all for me from now. I have a look at these research charts that mostly Nick is putting together. I provide my in between the line readings. By the way, the website, the portion of the website we have that is a little clunky. We are maybe, hopefully, later this month rolling out a new website with where it's going to be all fancy looking, a much better user experience to look at these. But the content, the information we give on these charts is hopefully as valuable, no matter what website we wrap them in. So with that, have a great day, stay healthy, and touch base with you soon. Take care.